All right, we are back with another scripture discovery. Now we are in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. There's a part of me that's excited about walking through this passage with you. And it's because I spent quite a bit of time looking through it already, because I'll be preaching this Sunday on this passage. And because of the subject matter, I really had to dive in and do my due diligence when it comes to our understanding of roles in marriage. This can be a touchy subject. To be honest, I'm a bit nervous preaching on this passage just as a man and a husband, and having to expound upon this command that Peter gives to wives to be subject to your own husbands. But as I worked through this passage, there were a lot of things that really the Lord, I feel, shared with me that was encouraging to my heart and a bit convicting. And not only convicting, but I think rather beautiful as well. My hope is as we study this together, you will also come to that same conclusion. Like I said before, I am preaching this passage, but it's going to be at Converge Community Church at 11 a.m. Sunday, and we're not live streaming that service. It will be recorded though, and the sermon will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. But if you're not attending this service, I would encourage you to check out our 10 a.m. service, and their Pastor Rob will be preaching on this passage. So I just want to encourage you, come check out either Sawyer Highlands Church service Sunday at 10 a.m. or come to Converge Community Church at 11 a.m. And if you don't do those, make sure you check out the YouTube channel and live stream our 10 a.m. service. All right, make sure you grab a cup of coffee, grab pen, pencil, grab the passage, get yourself comfortable, and let's work through this passage together. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. All right. In chapter 3, Peter starts with the word likewise. So he's making a comparison, and I would suggest it's chapter 2, verse 13, where he says for all of us to be subject for the Lord's sake to every institution, as well as verse 18, where he says to servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. So we definitely want to go back and look through those passages, understanding its context, because it is one flow of thought. And I know I keep hitting this point that I think it all goes back to, at least this section, with these three commands to be subject. It goes back to verse 11 and 12, where Peter calls the church sojourners and exiles. Now to verse 12, to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. So the question is how is the church to live among those who do not believe? He tells them to live honorably. And then he unpacks that. So verse 13, be subject for the Lord's sake to every institution. That's all of us. There's authority over us. We are to be subject to them in this world. Secondly, in the role of master and slave, there's one that has authority, the slave or the servant is called to be subject to the master. And then here with husbands and wives, husbands have authority in their household, and the wife is called to be subject to the husband. Why does Peter bring this up? So this is the third time that Peter gives this command to be subject. This time it's for wives to be subject to your own husbands, and he gives some reasoning behind it. Be subject to your own husbands so. There's a goal in mind. What is that goal? That even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. So there's a general thought of wives to be subject to their own husbands. He's pointing out the situation of a believing wife and an unbelieving husband. And I think that there's a reason why he brings out this detail. In the New Testament time, husbands being the head of the household and having authority, that was a very normal thing, and wives would submit under their authority even when it came to religion. So whatever religion or idols that the husband worshipped, the rest of the household would follow suit, including the wife. But there is a dilemma that takes place if the wife becomes a Christian. Remember how Peter describes the church or the people of God. In chapter 2, verse 9, he says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." So God becomes the authority. What happens when two authorities in your life conflict with one another? And I think this is what Peter is unpacking. Because of our freedom we have, because now we are aligned with God, we are under his authority, there is a temptation to throw off all human authority in our lives. They rule us no longer, it is God who rules us. And I think Peter is coming back and saying, no, there is a way where we are to live separate, to be holy. That means to live separate, not to sin, but to be servants of God and to be subject to all human authority, including the relationship between husband and wife. So imagine this, a wife becoming a Christian. And because she becomes a Christian, she's now under the authority of God and wants to obey God, but her husband is still an idol worshiper. What does she do? The temptation may be to throw off all authority from the husband, but Peter's saying no, the call is to continue to be subject to your own husbands. Even if some do not obey the word, they may be won. And here's the goal: without a word, but by the conduct of their wives. Verse 1, they may be won. Verse 2, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Notice the contrast. Without a word, they may be won without a word, but when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Respectful, pure. I think Peter is giving some broad principles, and it's going to take the wife, the believing wife, some discernment and wisdom in how to practice these things. So she's called to be subject, to be respectful. Let's change this up, to be consistent. They are called to be subject, to be respectful, and pure conduct. So whether it's the Emperor Supreme who demands the worship of his people, or it's the husband that demands the worship of idols, what are we to do? What is the wife to do? So in one aspect, they are to listen and obey God rather than men or the human authorities. But that doesn't mean that they fight against that authority or try to get out from under that authority. They are still to humble themselves, be subject to that authority, to be respectful, and to conduct themselves in a pure way. Let me give you an example of this. Think of Peter and John going before the high council and them demanding that Peter and John abstain from speaking the name of Jesus. That is in exact opposition to Jesus' command to be witnesses and proclaim his name. What does Peter do? Peter does not draw the sword. Peter does not shake his fist. It looks like quite a bit of respect and honor. He tells them, whether it be right for us to obey God or man, you be the judge, but we cannot stop speaking the name of Christ. We, as Christians, face the same dilemmas today with authority, whether it's the government authority, whether it's in our workplace or within a marriage with husbands and wives. The call is still to submit. How do we do that and still be respectful and act in a pure and good way? I don't think there are easy answers. Continuing on, all right, I think verse 1 and 2 is obviously one whole thought. That's just one sentence, verses 1 and 2. Peter switches topics a little bit in verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external. And he unpacks what he means by that: the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. So issues concerning the braiding of hair, jewelry, clothing. I don't know why I'm circling these, except for the fact that these are the topics, the areas that we need to consider. These are all external things, of course, but there's our contrast. Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart. So that's the contrast, adorning yourself externally, the outward appearance, or the inner person, the hidden person of the heart. Notice you are to adorn the hidden person of the heart with imperishable beauty. I love that phrase. Beauty that is imperishable. What is that? Well, we know it's a gentle and quiet spirit. I'm also going to point that back to the word external, understanding that the external is fleeting, or at least for hair, jewelry, clothing, all those are fleeting for some of us. Maybe not as much women, but with men, hair will fall out. It disappears. It turns gray. Obviously, we die and our bodies disintegrate. It's fleeting. It doesn't last. Jewelry may last for a long time, but it's still fleeting, and so is clothing. But there is beauty that is imperishable. It cannot be destroyed. It lasts, and it's a gentle and quiet spirit. This is what wives are encouraged or called to adorn. Do not be concerned about the outward appearance. That is not what is valuable. It's fleeting, but be more concerned about adorning yourself with the hidden person of the heart, with something that is imperishable. It's a beauty. It's beautiful, and it's imperishable. What is it? A gentle and quiet spirit. And I love the last phrase, which in God's sight is very precious. That phrase has stuck with me since I first started studying and reading this passage. This quality is precious in God's sight. There are two other places where God talks about how he views something, the phrase in God's sight, or in the sight of God. The first one is in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. As you come to him, that's Jesus, as you come to Jesus, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and what? Precious. So even though men view Jesus in a way that they reject him, he's not important, he's not valuable, that's not how God sees Jesus. God sees him as chosen and precious. The other one is in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20, talking about servants being subject to masters. Verse 20 says, "For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God." So when we are treated unjustly for doing good, we may not see that as a gracious thing. Most likely, we think of it as a terrible thing, and we want to avoid it at all cost. But that's not how God sees it. He sees it as a gracious thing. And then here, in adorning a gentle and quiet spirit, which is imperishable and beautiful in God's sight. It's very precious to him. I think it's so fitting. God sees Jesus as chosen and precious in his sight, and he sees the adorning of a gentle and quiet spirit in a wife's heart as very precious. With everything that is going on in our world today, when you turn on television, radio, look up the news on the internet, you will hear different perspectives and different opinions about the events and words and circumstances. When we watch these things and hear these things, we understand that there are many perspectives. And it's good to be silent and listen to these various perspectives. But make no mistake, there's only one perspective that is aligned with reality, that is aligned with truth, and that's God's perspective. We as fallible human beings give opinions, thoughts, ideas of what we consider truth. Make no mistake, God does not give opinions. He speaks, and it becomes reality. He sees as it truly is. So when God says that a gentle and quiet spirit is precious in his sight, that is absolutely true, whether that's our perspective or not. My prayer is that we would seek out God's perspective and see through his eyes, so we too might see what he sees. All right, too much preaching. We need to move on. Verse 5, "For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves." Sorry about the word holy. I don't know how the H got cut out, but that word is holy. Notice that they hoped in God. I think this is very similar to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. Speaking of Jesus, he didn't revile when he was reviled. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. But what did he do? He continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He trusted in the Lord. I think here this is very similar. The holy women, most we read in the Old Testament, they hoped in God. They entrusted themselves to God as well. That's how they adorned themselves, specifically submitting to their own husbands. The example is Sarah. She obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children. You imitate her if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So when you hope in God, submit to your own husbands, you are walking in the steps of Sarah. You are mimicking her. And of course, we are all to do the same thing with Jesus, right? He is our example of this as well. So the holy women of old, they are actually portraying Christ as they submit to authority, specifically their husbands, when they hope in God. All right, you are her children. Here's the condition: if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So doing good, having good conduct in our previous verses above. And then he adds, do not fear. I'm wondering if Peter's really getting to the root of our hearts when it's difficult to submit or subject ourselves to authorities. Because when we humble ourselves in that way, we are releasing control. And that's a very frightening thing. We crave control. We want to be the gods and masters of our own lives. And it's very threatening to submit ourselves to another, whether it's God or any human authority. So stepping back, and I know we're not finished with the passage yet, but stepping back and looking at this section when it's calling us to be subject to human authorities, I think God is wanting to adjust our perspective of things in this way. We are still called to submit to authority, but instead of entrusting ourselves to them and releasing control to them, what we're actually doing is releasing control to the Lord, knowing that He is sovereign over all, knowing that He is in control of all things, knowing that He has put all authority in its place, and knowing that all authority is His to begin with. That is a very challenging transition in perspective, to entrust ourselves to the Lord in that way. That's scary. But we see wonderful examples of that. We see it in the Old Testament. For example, Sarah. We see it in Ruth. Your God will become my God. Your lot in life will be my lot in life. She submits herself. Think of, in the New Testament, the lives of Peter, John, Paul. They entrust their lives to the Lord. They face opposition. They get arrested and beaten. And while they're sitting in jail, they're lifting up songs and prayers to the Lord. And we see God do mighty acts. What would happen if we entrusted ourselves to the Lord in that way? In a way where we no longer fear anything that is frightening. I wonder what God would do. Verse 7, likewise, this is another likewise. Likewise, husbands, here's the husband's command, live with your wives in an understanding way. What a strange command, especially that word understanding. Now we could go with Ephesians chapter 5 and think husbands, love your wives. Nope, Peter says live with your wives in an understanding way. I was thinking a lot about that word today and how it applies to our wives. What does that mean, husbands? What does that mean, to live with your wives in an understanding way? Of course, he kind of unpacks that, right? I think in the next phrase, showing honor. So we are to honor our wives. It's interesting that he says showing honor to the woman. Initially, I would think that what Peter's saying here is it's just not wives that we show honor to, but all women. But this is interesting. As, so the perspective of, or as the weaker vessel. You know, I envision Peter writing this, and he's speaking it out loud as he's writing it, and his wife is next to him. And when he uses that phrase, weaker vessel, I wonder if he got the look. It's not a very endearing phrase. And the fear is, by explaining it, you have the potential of digging yourself in a deeper hole. So the question is, what does he mean by that? To honor the woman as the weaker vessel. But I think weaker vessel is specifically pointing out just the physical differences between men and women, that men are physically stronger, which means they are the ones most likely to be the providers and protectors. If you think throughout history and the curse that took place way back in Genesis, remember God cursed the ground, and by the sweat of the brow of men, they will make bread and draw out food from the ground. So that kind of manual labor required quite a bit of strength in order to provide for their family. So God provided men with a certain amount of strength in order to survive. Throughout history, we see were the main providers and protectors. So men, with their strength, were the providers and the protectors of their family and their wives. So showing honor is providing for them, caring over them, protecting them, but certainly not to devalue them, because maybe their frame or their vessel is weaker. They are heirs with you of the grace of life. That is a very important truth. And this is where we are the same. We are made in God's image. And yes, we are both men and women. We are both sinners, but God has saved us. And we have an inheritance. We are heirs. We are sons and daughters of the living God, and we will all, those of us who put our trust in Christ, doesn't matter if we're men, women, slaves, masters, this is a wonderful truth. Because remember, our vessels, whether weak or strong, no matter what, they will fade. Our vessels will decay. There is an inheritance. There is a final resurrection. So we need to view our wives in light of that truth. That is God's perspective. That's how He views our wives. And we are to do the same. They are heirs with us of the grace of life. So that your prayers will not be hindered. It looks to me as though our relationship with our wives and how we treat them will definitely affect our relationship with God. We engage with God through prayer, and I think it's a very serious thing, a sign of judgment when our prayers are hindered. So husbands, we are to take these commands very seriously. To live with our wives in an understanding way and to show honor to them, knowing the truth that they are heirs with you of the grace of life. All right, let me finish up by figuring out the structure. We started with verse 1 and 2 being one section concerning wives being subject to your own husbands. I think verse 3 and 4 is one section, and maybe you can include 5 and 6, but I'm going to keep that separate by just saying this is the example that Peter gives. This is what he's meaning by adorning the hidden person of the heart. And then, of course, this is a new section, verse 7, pertaining to husbands. All right, hopefully that gives you a taste for what will come on Sunday morning. And I also hope that going through this together will inspire you to dive deeper into this passage and really think through what God is communicating to us. There's some very challenging commands and some insight in God's perspective of reality. May the Spirit work in your hearts throughout the rest of the week, that you may be more like Christ and walk in His steps. And with that, we'll see you next time.